The night my wife's boss put his hand on my shoulder and told me I was lucky to be here. I smiled, nodded, and said nothing. That was the last mistake he ever made. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I spent 18 years building something real, a structural engineering consultancy, just me and 2 drafting tables in a converted garage, until it wasn't. Until it was 12 employees in a downtown office with glass walls and a view of the river. I did that with calloused hands, and 7-day weeks, and a lot of years when my wife and I ate pasta 4 nights out of 7 because the margins were thin and the risk was constant. We had a son, 8 years old that autumn. He had his mother's eyes and my stubbornness, and he was the reason I drove 40 minutes each way every morning instead of renting closer to the office. He needed to grow up in a neighborhood with a real backyard and kids on bikes, not a condo tower with a doorman. My wife worked in corporate communications for a development firm called Aldgate Partners. She'd been there 6 years. She was good at her job, smart, polished, the kind of person who could walk into a room and read it in 30 seconds. I admired that about her. I admired a lot of things about her. Once. The gala was in October. Aldgate Partners hosted it every year at the Meridian Club downtown. One of those rooms with chandeliers the size of small cars and waitstaff who moved like they were trained not to make eye contact. It was a fundraiser, technically, for some urban development foundation. In practice, it was a room full of people in expensive clothing congratulating each other on being in the same room. I wore the charcoal suit I'd bought for my business partner's wedding 3 years earlier. It still fit. My wife wore a green dress I'd never seen before, and when I mentioned it in the car, she said she'd had it for a while, and I just hadn't noticed. I should have noticed more things sooner. That's not self-pity. That's just the truth. The room was already loud when we arrived. My wife moved through it differently than she moved through our house. Lighter somehow. More certain. She introduced me to colleagues whose names I forgot immediately, accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray, and within 20 minutes she'd drifted into a cluster of people near the far windows, laughing at something I hadn't heard. I found myself standing near the bar, talking to a man named Heston, who was some kind of land acquisition specialist and who had opinions about zoning law that I didn't ask for. I smiled and listened and watched my wife across the room. That was when I first saw him. He was maybe 52, 53. Silver at the temples, the kind of jawline that photographs well. He wore his suit the way men wear suits when they've never had to worry about whether they could afford one. His name was Court Bellamy, and he was the managing director of Aldgate Partners. And he had been my wife's direct supervisor for 4 of the 6 years she'd worked there. I knew who he was. I'd never met him in person. He came over to where my wife was standing, and the group around her shifted. Subtle, the way a tide shifts, to make space for him at the center. My wife touched his arm when she laughed. Just briefly. The way you touch someone when you're comfortable with them. Somewhere around 8 o'clock, he made his way to me. I want to be precise about this, because it matters. He didn't come over to introduce himself or make conversation. He came over with the specific energy of a man who wants to establish something. He shook my hand too firmly, held it a half second too long, and said, "You must be the husband. She talks about you." I said it was good to meet him. He looked around the room the way people do when they want you to know they own it. Then he looked back at me and said, "She's exceptional, you know. One of the best we have. We keep waiting for her to outgrow us." He smiled. I imagine it's quite something, being married to someone operating at her level. I looked at him. I said, "She's always been the sharpest person in any room she walks into. I learned that early." He nodded slowly, like I'd said something quaint. Then he put his hand on my shoulder, just rested it there for a moment, and said, "Well, you're lucky to have her, lucky to be here." And then he moved on. I stood there with my drink. The chandeliers hummed quietly above me. On the other side of the room, my wife was laughing again, and Court Bellamy had rejoined the cluster around her, and I watched the way she stood differently when he was close. I drove home that night, thinking about the way he'd said it. Lucky to be here. Not lucky to have. That would have been an insult, but a recognizable one. Lucky to be here. In this room. In this life. As if I was a guest at something I hadn't built. As if the 18 years and the calloused hands and the pasta 4 nights a week were a preamble to this moment of being allowed to stand in his chandelier room and shake his hand. I thought about it for a long time. I want to be clear about something. I didn't act on a feeling. I'm not that kind of person. I've spent my entire career making decisions based on evidence and load-bearing capacity, not intuition. Before I did anything at all, I spent 3 weeks simply paying attention. I paid attention to the way my wife's phone went face down on the kitchen counter every evening when she got home. I paid attention to the working late nights that clustered on Tuesdays and Thursdays, which happened to be the nights our son had swim practice, and I picked him up. I paid attention to the way she'd started talking about Court Bellamy differently. Less as a boss, more as an authority, someone whose opinions she quoted in casual conversation the way you quote someone whose judgment you've accepted as superior to your own. I paid attention to the mileage on her car. One Thursday in November, when she told me she'd be late because of a client dinner, I checked the mileage before she left, and again when she got home. She'd driven 41 miles. The office was 9 miles from our house. The restaurant she named was 11. I didn't say anything that night. The next week I placed a small magnetic tracker under the rear wheel well of her car. It cost $60. It was the most important $60 I ever spent. I want to say something here about what it feels like to be gathering evidence against the person you sleep next to. It doesn't feel like detective work. It doesn't feel righteous. It feels like standing at the top of a staircase in the dark, knowing there's a step missing somewhere below you, and not knowing whether it's the first step or the last. I already had a lawyer by this point. His name was Aldous Fenn, and he came recommended by a colleague who'd been through a difficult divorce 2 years earlier. The first thing Aldous said to me in his office on the 14th floor of a building 3 blocks from mine was, "Don't move money. Don't change accounts. Don't do anything that looks like preparation. Just document." So I documented. The tracker showed me what I needed to know within 10 days. On a Tuesday, my wife left the office at 6:14 p.m. She did not go to a client dinner or a work function. She drove to a residential neighborhood in Belmont Hill, 12 minutes from our house, and parked on a street called Crestwood Lane. The car stayed there for 3 hours and 17 minutes. Then it came home. I looked up Crestwood Lane. Court Bellamy owned a house there. I found it in about 4 minutes, using public property records. I didn't drive to Crestwood Lane that night. I didn't need to. The data was already doing what data does. I want to tell you what I did with the 3 days after that, because I think it matters. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't drink. I didn't call a friend and unload. I went to work. I picked my son up from swim practice. I helped him with a diorama about the water cycle that was due Friday. I watched him cut small cloud shapes from cotton balls and glue them to the inside of a shoebox lid. And I thought, this is the thing I'm protecting. Not my pride. Not my ego. This. Aldous Fenn had been through this more than I had. He sat across from me with a yellow legal pad and asked me methodical questions. What assets were in joint names? What was my business structure? Was the house in both names? The house was in both names. The business was solely mine. An LLC I'd formed before we were married, which Aldous confirmed was a meaningful distinction in our state. There was a joint savings account and a joint checking account. There was also a retirement account in my name only. Aldous was not an emotional man, which was exactly what I needed. He explained to me that in a no-fault divorce state, infidelity didn't affect property division directly. What affected it was documentation, timing, and the story the assets told. What we want, he said, is for the story to be complete and accurate before she knows she's in it. He also said, "Does she know about the tracker?" I said no. He said, "Good. Keep it that way for now." The documentation phase lasted 6 weeks. In that time, the tracker recorded 8 visits to Crestwood Lane. I printed every log. I kept them in a folder on my desk at the office, not at home. I also began the process, quietly, legally, with Aldous guiding every step, of moving certain assets into a business trust that had been permissible under my LLC structure all along. It wasn't hiding anything. It was simply making sure that what I'd built before this marriage was correctly categorized as what it had always been, mine. I didn't enjoy any of it. I want to be clear about that too. Some men in this situation. I've read enough of these stories online to know the type. Seem to relish the operation of it, the strategy, the chess. I just wanted it to be over. I wanted to wake up in a version of my life that made sense. The moment I'd been building toward came in December. My wife told me she had a weekend conference in Phoenix. Her firm was sending a team. She'd be gone Friday through Sunday. She'd call every night. She did not go to Phoenix. The tracker put her car in the long-term parking lot at Logan Airport at 7:48 a.m. on Friday. I checked the Aldgate Partners website that evening. There was no conference listed in their events calendar. I cross-referenced the Phoenix Convention Center schedule for that weekend. Nothing relevant. I had a private investigator by then, someone Aldous had referred me to, A quiet woman named Petra Koss, who worked out of an unmarked office in Somerville and had been doing domestic investigations for 20 years. She was at Logan when they arrived back Sunday evening. She got what she needed. I looked at the photographs on a Monday morning, sitting in Aldous' office. He had printed them on plain copy paper, which somehow made them worse. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "All right, what do we do next?" That was the version of myself I am most proud of, I think. Not dramatic, not broken. Just, what do we do next? The answer, it turned out, was we filed. My wife found out on a Wednesday. She came home from work, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with my son, who'd already eaten dinner and was doing a puzzle on the floor of the living room. I told him to go pick out a movie, and I'd be there in 10 minutes. He grabbed the dog by the collar. We had a beagle. His name was Chester, and they disappeared down the hall together. I slid the envelope across the table. She looked at it. She looked at me. She said, "What is this?" I said, "Divorce papers. Aldous Finn is my attorney. His number is on the top page." She didn't open the envelope. She sat down. She said my name, not in an angry way, in a careful way, the way you say someone's name when you're trying to figure out how much they know. I said, "I know about Crestwood Lane. I know about Phoenix. I know about all of it." She went very still. "I'm not here to have a conversation about it tonight," I said. "There's nothing to discuss that would change anything. What I'm going to tell you is that I've been working with my attorney for 8 weeks, which means the filing is complete, the asset documentation is complete, and there are no surprises in those papers for anyone except possibly you." She said, "You did this behind my back." I thought about Court Bellamy's hand on my shoulder. Lucky to be here. I thought about 8 visits to Crestwood Lane. I thought about cotton ball clouds glued to a shoebox lid. I said, "Yes." The next few months were not clean. I won't pretend they were. She retained an attorney who sent 2 strongly worded letters about the business trust. Aldous responded both times with documentation showing the trust had been legally established within the existing LLC framework, predating the marriage in its foundational structure. After the second exchange, her attorney went quiet on that issue. Our son took it the way 8-year-olds take things when the adults around them try hard enough to protect them from the worst of it. With confusion and occasional anger and a lot of questions about Chester the dog and whether Chester would have to choose. Chester would not have to choose. Chester would stay with our son, wherever our son was. I want to say something about Court Bellamy, because I imagine people want to know. He and my wife did not end up together. I found that out through mutual acquaintances about 4 months later. Not because I was looking for it, but because in a city this size, information moves. He'd apparently ended things shortly after the divorce filing. Whether out of caution or disinterest or something else, I don't know. I don't think about it much. He's not the point of this story. He never was. The point of this story is a conversation I had with my son about 6 months after everything settled. We were in the backyard, him and me and Chester, on a Saturday morning in early summer. He was trying to teach Chester to catch a frisbee, which Chester was refusing to do on the grounds that he was a beagle and not a retriever, and my son was explaining this to Chester in patient, detailed terms as if the dog simply hadn't understood the assignment. I watched them and I thought, I built this. Not the marriage that's gone, and it went for reasons I understand now, even if I'll never fully accept them. But this moment, this backyard, this kid who argues patiently with a dog, this I built and this I kept. My attorney told me once, during one of our early meetings when I was still figuring out how angry I was allowed to be, that the men who come into his office and fare the best in difficult divorces are the ones who decide early what they're fighting for rather than what they're fighting against. I wrote that down. I think about it still. Court Bellamy told me I was lucky to be in that room, and maybe he was right in the way he meant it. I don't know those people. I didn't go to the right schools. I built what I built the long way. But there are different kinds of rooms, and I've learned that the rooms that matter most are the ones you build yourself, one wall at a time, with people who'd stay even when the margins are thin and the pasta comes 4 nights out of 7. I know which kind of room I want to live in. I know, now, which kind of man I am. I still think about the moment I slid that envelope across the kitchen table. Not because it felt powerful. It didn't. It felt like the last day of a long illness. Like something had finally stopped that had been hurting for a long time without me fully admitting it. People ask when they hear a story like this whether I was angry. Of course I was angry. But anger is loud, and loud doesn't win. What wins is knowing what you're doing and why, and being patient enough to do it right. That's the thing Court Bellamy never understood about me. when he put his hand on my shoulder and said I was lucky to be there. He looked at a man in a 3-year-old suit and read the surface. He didn't read what was underneath it. The years of decisions made carefully, the habit of building things that last. The understanding that the way you respond to a provocation matters more than the provocation itself. There's a version of that night where I say something sharp back to him, where I let him see that his comment landed. I'm glad I'm not that version of myself. Because the moment you react, you've told the other person exactly where you are. And where I was that October night was already 3 steps ahead of a problem I hadn't yet fully named. I've thought a lot about what it actually takes to get through something like this without losing yourself in it. Not the legal steps. Aldous walked me through those. But the internal ones. The ones nobody talks about. It takes a kind of honesty that most people avoid, because it means looking at your own situation without flinching and asking what's actually true, not what you wish were true. I knew, somewhere in the back of my mind, before I ever placed that tracker on her car. I just hadn't been willing to call it what it was. The courage isn't in the confrontation. The courage is in being willing to see clearly when seeing clearly is the last thing you want to do. It also takes intelligence, not the credential kind, not the kind that gets you into rooms with chandeliers, the practical kind. The kind that says, document before you act, consult before you move money, understand the structure before you start dismantling anything. I built a business the same way, one load-bearing decision at a time, never pulling a support beam without knowing what it's holding up. The men who get destroyed in situations like mine are usually the ones who act from emotion before they understand the terrain. I'd spent 18 years learning not to do that. And then there's something harder to name. The part that kept me sitting at that kitchen table helping my son glue cotton balls to a shoebox lid while my life was quietly falling apart around me. I don't have a clean word for it. It's the thing that gets you out of bed when you'd rather not. The thing that says, he needs to see you functional, so be functional. The thing that says, you built this once, you can build again. It isn't optimism exactly. It's more like a refusal. A quiet, deliberate refusal to let someone else's choices define the shape of what's left. Court Bellamy thought I was lucky to be in his room. 6 months later, I had breakfast with my son in a backyard I'd kept, in a life I rebuilt on my own terms. Chester the Beagle was losing an argument with a frisbee. The morning was ordinary and mine. I'll take ordinary and mine over lucky any day.